Nobody talks about what happens behind the velvet ropes. The cameras catch the smiles, the waves, the perfectly pressed coats, and the coordinated colors, and the hats that cost more than most people's rent. What the cameras don't catch, what they're specifically positioned not to catch, is everything else. The whispered corrections, the stiff shoulders, the way a child's face can change in half a second when an adult's hand moves too fast in their direction. Most people watch the royal family the way they watch a snow globe. Beautiful, contained, safe behind glass. They shake it, watch the flakes fall, and feel something warm and distant. They never think about what it's like to live inside the globe. Charlotte did. She had been living inside it since the day she was born, which was, by the way, a Tuesday, and nobody asked her if that was convenient. She arrived into a world of preparation she had no say in. The names chosen before she could speak. The role written before she could walk. The public assigned to love her before she even knew what love was supposed to feel like. By the time she was old enough to understand what a crowd was, she already knew how to stand in front of one. Chin level, shoulders back, smile but not too wide, that looks desperate. Eyes forward but soft, not blank. Way from the elbow, not the wrist. Don't fidget, don't yawn, don't scratch your nose, even if it itches like it's hosting a small insect community inside it. She had learned all of this the way other children learn to ride a bike. Repetition, correction, and the ever-present awareness that falling would be witnessed. She was 8 years old on the day that everything the public thought they knew about the royal family cracked. Just slightly, just enough, and let a little of the real light in. It was a Wednesday, an engagement at a garden charity event in the grounds of a private estate in Berkshire. The kind of event that gets 4 paragraphs in the court circular and 200 photographs, none of which will show what actually mattered. There were flowers, naturally, rows of them color-coordinated in that very English way that looks accidental, but is absolutely not. There were children from local schools arranged in 2 lines like small, excited sentinels. There were officials and patrons and people who had rehearsed their curtsies in their bathrooms that morning. And there was the family. They arrived in the usual formation, a choreography so practiced it looked like breathing. The king slightly ahead, his expression doing that thing it does where it's warm and formal simultaneously, like a fireplace behind bulletproof glass. Camilla at his side, her posture the architecture of a woman who has spent decades being looked at and has decided somewhere along the way to look back. William and Catherine a respectful distance behind. William with that way he has of making every room feel slightly safer by being in it. And the children, George, Charlotte, Louis, moving in the careful, trained way of people who know they're being watched and have accepted it. Charlotte was wearing pale blue. Her hair was in that half-up style that Catherine favored for public engagements. Tidy enough to be respectable, loose enough to look like a child still. She was carrying a small posy of flowers that one of the school children had pressed in her hands at the gate, and she was holding it with both hands the way she'd been taught to receive gifts. Carefully. Gratefully, like it mattered. It did matter to her. That was the thing nobody ever quite understood about Charlotte. She wasn't performing warmth. She had it. It came out of her sideways, in unexpected moments. The way she tilted her head when she was listening hard to someone, the way she laughed before she could stop herself at something genuinely funny. She was a child who felt things strongly and had been trained with great love and considerable effort to feel them quietly. The garden was large, and the engagement was structured in that particular royal way, a slow progression through a series of stations, each with its designated purpose and its designated people. There was a section where the children from the local schools would present artwork, a section where the patrons of the charity would be formally introduced, a section where the family would see the gardens themselves and the work the charity had funded. And there was, at the far end near a low stone wall covered in climbing roses, a moment that had not been on any schedule. It started the way most real things start. Without announcement, Camilla was speaking with one of the senior patrons, a woman of 70-something with the kind of face that has stored decades of opinions and lets them out carefully, one at a time. They were discussing something to do with the garden's water features, which sounds dull, but was apparently not, because Camilla's attention was genuinely engaged. She had that quality, the ability to be actually interested in what she was actually doing, which sounds obvious, but in public life is rarer than diamonds. Charlotte had drifted, not far, a few feet, which in royal terms is practically across a continent. She had spotted something near the base of the rose wall. A beetle, enormous, glossy, deeply unbothered by the fact that it was sharing space with the monarchy. It was doing something purposeful with a small piece of bark, and Charlotte had crouched down to watch it with the total unself-conscious absorption that children apply to things that adults have decided are beneath them. She was not thinking about her posture. She was not thinking about the cameras. She was not thinking about anything except the beetle, which had now changed direction and was heading toward a gap in the stone with the confidence of someone who knows exactly where they're going. Charlotte. Camilla's voice was not loud. It was in fact quite soft, but it had a quality that cut through things, a precision that came not from hardness, but from certainty. It was the voice of a woman who had learned, over a very long time, that you don't need volume when you have clarity. Charlotte looked up. The beetle escaped. "Come here, please." It was not unkind, but it was not a question either. Charlotte straightened, clutching her posy, and walked a few feet back to where Camilla stood. The senior patron had been joined by two others, and there was a small cluster of event staff at the edges of the group, the usual human furniture of these occasions, present but invisible. What happened next lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Camilla reached out, her left hand, quick and certain, and touched Charlotte's shoulder. Not a gentle touch, not the light, guiding pressure of a hand steering a child into position. It was sharper than that. A correction. The kind that says, "You drifted, come back, we are being watched." It was not violence. Nobody in the history of careful language would call it that. But it was not soft either. And it landed on Charlotte with a visibility that a certain eye, a trained eye, a watching eye, would catch. The certain eye belonged to James Hargreave. He was 34 years old and had been with the Protection Command for 6 years. He stood 7 feet away, which is the approximate distance at which he could be immediately useful without being intrusive. He had a face that said nothing professionally, smooth, still, capable of expressing exactly as much as required, and not 1 decimal point more. He had stood in rooms with world leaders, and in corridors with criminals, and in gardens exactly like this one, and his face had never once done anything without his permission. It moved now, not much, a fraction. The jaw shifted. The eyes, which had been doing that wide-field scan that protection officers develop like a sixth sense, narrowed very slightly, and then returned to neutral. But someone saw it. One of the photographers, not the official royal photographers who were positioned at approved angles and understood the contract of their access, but a freelance photographer named Dana Osei who had press credentials and a position near the rose wall, and an instinct that had taken her 15 years to develop, happened to be looking at Hargreave when his face did its fraction of a thing. She didn't know what she'd caught. Not yet. She had 340 photographs from that day. She would go home, she would edit, she would sleep, and she would wake up at 2 in the morning and open her laptop and scroll back to that sequence and look at it for a long time. Then she would send it to her editor, and then the world would begin to have opinions. Charlotte did not know any of this was happening. She was standing with her shoulders back and her chin level and her posy in both hands, and her face was doing the thing her face had learned to do, composed, pleasant, present. If the correction had stung her, she did not show it. If she had feelings about it, they were hers, and she kept them. That was the thing about Charlotte. She kept things. The engagement continued. There was the presentation of the school artwork, a series of large paintings of the garden in different seasons, vivid and slightly lopsided in the way that children's art is when it is genuinely meant rather than curated. Charlotte stood in front of a painting of winter, bare branches, gray sky, a single robin on a stone wall, and looked at it with that head tilt of hers. The teacher who had organized the project, a young woman with paint-stained fingers and the expression of someone who has not slept enough this week, stood beside her. One of our year 3s did that, the teacher said. He said the robin was the bravest bird because it stays when everything else leaves. Charlotte looked at the robin for a moment. "I like that," she said. She said it quietly, and it was not for the cameras, and that was exactly why it mattered. Hargreave, 7 feet away, watched the interaction and filed it somewhere that was not a report and not a database. Just the part of a person that stores things that mean something. The formal photographs were taken at 4:15. The family arranged themselves with the practiced ease of people who have done this so many times that their bodies know the angles without being told. Charlotte stood between George and her mother, and she smiled. The real smile, not the public one, which was both rarer and slightly more crooked, at something Lewis said under his breath that made Catherine's eyes go bright with suppressed amusement. By 4:45, they were in the cars and gone. By 5 o'clock, Dana Osei was on the train back to London with 340 photographs, and one in particular that she kept returning to. It showed Camilla's hand on Charlotte's shoulder, the angle, the slight forward lean of the motion, the weight of it visible in the line of Charlotte's small body as it absorbed the contact. And in the background, slightly out of focus but unmistakably present, James Hargreaves' face doing its fraction of a thing. It was not a photograph of something terrible, but it was a photograph of something true. Dana Osei looked at it for a long time. Then she closed her laptop and looked out the window at the dark English countryside going past at 100 miles an hour and thought about what truth costs when you put it in public. She would decide in the morning. She decided at 2 in the morning instead. By the time London woke up, the image was already moving, quiet, and deliberate, like a beetle who knows exactly where it's going. Nobody had planned this. Nobody had coordinated it. There was no agenda, no conspiracy, no meeting in a back room. There was only a photograph and a caption and the particular modern physics by which a single image, once released into the current, travels faster than anyone who released it expected. By 8 in the morning, it had 30,000 views. By noon, it had 120,000, and it had acquired something that made it dangerous, a narrative. Not the one Dana Osei had intended, which was careful and qualified and full of the responsible language of someone who understood they were holding something fragile. The narrative the internet built was faster and louder and much less careful. It said, look what she did to that child. And that was where the real story began. Because the real story was not about what Camilla did or didn't do in a garden in Berkshire on a Wednesday afternoon. The real story was about what happens when a family that has no private life is asked to account for a private moment, and what it means that the person most qualified to speak to what happened, a 34-year-old protection officer with a face like a door, had let his face do something in public that his training had specifically taught him not to do. James Hargreaves went home that night and made himself a cup of tea and sat at his kitchen table and did not look at his phone. He knew. He had known the moment it happened. The moment his jaw had done its fraction of a thing, that he had made an error, not in judgment, in expression, which in his world amounted to the same thing. He sat with his tea going cold and thought about the girl with the posy and the beetle and the winter robin and about 3 seconds in a garden and about the particular weight of a hand moving faster than it needed to. He was not certain of anything. That was the problem. He was trained to respond to certainty, to threat assessment, to known categories, to the clear and unambiguous situations his protocols have been built for. This was not that. This was a gray space, the kind that didn't have a form to fill out or a supervisor to call. He drank his cold tea. He picked up his phone. He put it down again. He was going to have to make a decision. Not about what he'd seen. He couldn't unsee it and wouldn't pretend to. But about what he owed and to whom and in what order. He had sworn an oath to protect. The question he sat with, alone in his kitchen at 11 at night, was protect what exactly? And that question, it turned out, was the one that would change everything. By Thursday morning, the photograph had a nickname. The internet named everything eventually. News cycles, controversies, celebrity moments. It was how the machine processed things, by filing them under something short and memorable and slightly cruel. This one got called the shoulder, which was both accurate and completely insufficient, the way most nicknames are. The shoulder had 400,000 impressions by the time Kensington Palace's communications team arrived at their desks, most of them carrying the particular expression of people who have already checked their phones and are now calculating the distance between where they are and where they need to be. There are people whose entire professional existence is dedicated to managing what the public sees and thinks and feels about the royal family. They are not press officers in the traditional sense, not exactly. They are architects of perception. They build the story before anyone else can build a worse one, and they maintain the structure with a level of care that would be admirable in a different context. They were good at their jobs. They had been good at their jobs through worse than this. But worse than this had never involved a child. That was the variable nobody had a protocol for. The meeting started at 7:30. There were 3 of them before noon, a preliminary read of the situation, an escalation to senior communications, and a briefing that involved people with significantly better suits and significantly more direct lines to the principal households. The word proportionate was used 19 times in 4 hours. Response was used 31 times. Charlotte was used in those rooms as a category, a subject to be managed rather than a person who had been in a garden 2 days ago watching a beetle. What nobody in those rooms knew was that James Hargreave had also made some calls that morning. His first call was to his direct supervisor, a woman named Commander Patricia Vale, who had been in the Protection Command for 22 years and had the kind of institutional memory that made her simultaneously invaluable and occasionally terrifying. He told her about Wednesday. He told her what he had seen. He told her, with the careful, stripped-down language of someone who understands the weight of every word they're choosing, that he had a concern. She listened without interrupting. That was one of the things about Vale. She could be completely still in the way that water in a deep place is still, calm on the surface, and holding everything underneath. When he finished, she said, "Did you document it at the time?" "No." "Is there anything in the official log?" "No." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be meaningful. "Come in," she said. "Don't write anything down yet." "Come in." He drove to the office with the particular feeling in his chest of someone who has crossed a line they can't uncross and has made peace with it. The second call was different. He made it from his car, engine off, parked outside a coffee shop he didn't go into. He called a number he had memorized rather than stored, because storing it had felt like a paper trail he didn't want to leave. The number belonged to a woman named Fiona Ashworth, who was, depending on which conversation you were having, either a child welfare consultant retained by the Home Office or a very specific kind of person who existed in the gap between official and unofficial, between the thing that had a name and the thing that didn't. He had worked with her once before, 3 years ago. A different situation, a different family, the same gray space. "I need to talk to you," he said. "I know," she said, which was unnerving but not surprising. "I've seen it. I saw it in person." Silence. Then, when it happened. Another silence. Longer. "I need to know what you're asking me," she said. "Specifically, because the answer to different questions is very different." He stared through the windscreen at a woman walking a dog the size of a small sofa. The dog was investigating something on the pavement with tremendous commitment. "I'm asking you what I'm supposed to do with something I can't prove and can't unsee and can't pretend I didn't see." Fiona Ashworth said nothing for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had moved, slightly, subtly, from professional to something else. Something older and more careful. "You're asking the right question," she said. "That's actually important. Most people in your position ask the wrong one." "What's the wrong one?" Whether it was bad enough. He understood what she meant. He didn't say so. He didn't need to. They arranged to meet on Friday. He drove to the office. He walked into Vale's glass-walled corner room and sat across from a woman who had spent 22 years navigating exactly these kinds of corridors where everything was unofficial and nothing was without consequence. She pushed a cup of coffee across the desk toward him and said nothing, which was her version of kindness. "What I saw," he began, and then stopped because what he'd seen needed to be said correctly or not at all. Was a correction. Physical. Not dangerous. But he stopped again. "But," Vale said, "but the child's face." "Vali did." "She didn't flinch," he said. "That's the thing. She didn't react at all. She just absorbed it. The way you absorb something that's happened before." The room was quiet. Outside the window, London did its thing. Gray sky, pigeons, someone on a phone. "That's not evidence," Vale said. "No, that's an impression." "Yes." "Based on 3 seconds." "Yes." She drank her coffee. He watched her think in the careful, sequential way she had. She filed things, Vale, in real time, and you could see her doing it if you knew what to look for. Category. Wait. Implication. Response. "What's the photograph showing?" she said finally. "The photograph is showing what I saw." "Is it showing more than what you saw?" He thought about this honestly, because it deserved honesty. "Some of the captions are showing more than what I saw," he said carefully. "The photograph itself is accurate, but photographs don't have context." "No," she said. They never do. That's their power and their problem. She put down her coffee cup. She looked at him with the eyes of someone who was about to say something that would take up residence in his head for a long time. James, she said, you need to be very clear before you go further with this about what you're trying to protect and what you might be putting at risk in order to protect it. Because those two things might not be the same. He knew she was right. He had known it since the kitchen table the night before. He just hadn't wanted the knowing to be said out loud, because once it was said out loud, it had different weight. Meanwhile, in a different part of London, in a different kind of room with better furniture and older paintings on the walls, the conversation was also happening, just in a register so far removed from Hogree's kitchen table that they might as well have been speaking different languages. The room was in Clarence House, which is the kind of building that insists on its own importance through accumulated history and high ceilings and the particular smell of old wood and flowers and something else, something institutional that you can't identify, but that immediately tells your nervous system it is not a place for casual feelings. Camilla was there. She sat at a table that had seen more complex situations than this one and had absorbed them all without comment. She was drinking tea, proper tea, in a proper cup, the kind of small assertion of ordinary life that people under pressure use to remind themselves they're still people. And she was listening to the woman across from her who was explaining what 400,000 impressions meant and what trajectory they suggested. She listened in the way she listened to things, completely without the visible agitation that lesser confidence produces. Her face did not perform concern. It was too still for that. She was thinking, which looked from the outside like calm, but was in fact the opposite. When the woman finished, Camilla set down her cup. And Charlotte, she said, is she aware? Not the scale, ma'am. Not yet. William and Catherine, they've been briefed. There, the woman chose her word carefully, measured. Camilla looked at the table for a moment. Not the way people look at tables when they're avoiding something. The way people look at surfaces when they need a neutral space to place a thought. What I did, she said, was a correction of the type I have made and received more times than I can count in a setting exactly like that one. Her voice was even, not defensive. There was no crumbling in it, no brittleness, but precise. Whether it was the right correction or the best correction or the most gentle correction is a separate conversation, one I am entirely willing to have. She picked up her cup again. In private, the woman across the table nodded in a way that meant several things simultaneously. The difficulty, the woman said, is that it's no longer private. No, Camilla said. I am aware. What she said next was not in any of the reports that would later circulate. It was said quietly between two people in a room with good furniture and old paintings, and it stayed there. What she said was, how is she? The woman understood who she meant. Charlotte is Charlotte, the woman said, which was the diplomatic shorthand for, she's 8 years old, and she's fine on the surface, and underneath she's 8 years old. Camilla looked at the middle distance for a moment. She's more than she looks, she said. People always underestimate her. There was a particular texture to how she said it. Not guilt, not defensiveness, something more complicated, the recognition, perhaps, of something she actually believed about the child, something that sat uneasily alongside the moment in the garden and the 3 seconds that had started all of this. Charlotte, by Thursday afternoon, was at school. This is worth stopping on. The thing that the internet's noise machine and the communications meetings and the Clarence House conversations all shared was the complete absence of Charlotte herself. Her actual daily life, which on Thursday involved a history lesson, a maths test she had prepared for with the focused seriousness she applied to things she cared about getting right, and a 40-minute break during which she and a friend named Isla spent 20 minutes arguing cheerfully about which was a better animal, an octopus or a crow. Charlotte's position, held with the unshakable conviction of a child who has done her research, was the crow. They remember faces, she told Isla. They remember people who were unkind to them. For years, Isla thought this was slightly frightening. Charlotte thought it was wonderful. She came home to the usual choreography of security and quiet, the warm, particular quiet of a home that has been prepared for arrival, everything in its place. She had homework. She had dinner. She had the part of her evening that was hers and not public and not documented and not available for 400,000 opinions. She did not know, on Thursday evening, that James Hargreave had spent the afternoon in a glass-walled room deciding what he owed and to whom. She did not know that Fiona Ashworth was already pulling notes from 3 years ago. She did not know that in a very different room with much better furniture, someone had asked after her, and meant it. She didn't know that the crow remembered. She found that comforting in a way she couldn't have explained and didn't need to. At 9 o'clock, she turned off her light. The photograph, at 9 o'clock on Thursday, had 700,000 impressions, and the number was climbing with the implacable momentum of something that has found its current and is simply flowing now, no longer needing anyone to push it. The tabloids had it. The serious newspapers had it, framed in more careful language with more qualifications, but they had it. 2 American outlets had picked it up. A parenting forum had generated 46 pages of comments. A child welfare charity had issued a statement that said nothing very specific in a way that implied a great deal. A retired royal correspondent who had been on television 3 times in the last 18 months said, on television for a 4th time, that in all his years covering the royal family, he had never seen anything quite like this, which was the kind of statement that was simultaneously true and absolutely meaningless. James Hargreave's face blurred slightly, because the focus had been on Camilla and Charlotte, but, recognizable to anyone who had seen it before, was starting to attract its own conversation. Who was he? Why that expression? What did he see? He was sitting in his flat at 9 o'clock watching none of this, because he had made a deliberate choice not to, the way you don't press on a bruise to see how much it still hurts. He was thinking about Friday, about Fiona Ashworth and the gray space, and the question she had said was the right one. He was thinking about an 8-year-old who hadn't flinched, who had absorbed the correction and looked up and then gone back to standing correctly with her posy in both hands, chin level, shoulders back, as if her body had learned to receive things and immediately file them somewhere that didn't show. He had work protection for 6 years. He had stood near children in difficult situations before. He had been trained in the recognition of distress and the assessment of environments and the careful clinical evaluation of what he was seeing versus what he felt he was seeing. He knew the difference. He was very good at the difference. What he could not resolve was this. Knowing the difference didn't tell you what to do with what you'd seen. He went to bed. He did not sleep. The photograph kept its own hours. It moved through time zones, westward, into America, where it was still afternoon, where it had a different flavor on different platforms, where the captions were louder and less careful, and the comments were a different temperature entirely. It crossed into Europe. It found its way into contexts its originator hadn't imagined, and conversations it had nothing to do with. By Friday morning, it had passed 1 million. By Friday morning, James Hargreave was already in his car, driving to meet a woman who existed in the gap between official and unofficial, because some situations don't have a form to fill out. He drove through London in early light, and the city was doing its thing, gray and familiar, and full of people who had no idea what was happening in any of the rooms where things were being decided. That was cities. That was always cities. Enormous, indifferent, continuous. He found a parking space 2 streets from the cafe. He sat in the car for a moment. He thought about the crow that remembered. He got out of the car. Fiona Ashworth arrived first. She was already at a corner table with a flat white she hadn't touched when Hargreave walked in, and she had the look of a person who had been awake since 4 in the morning, not because something was wrong, but because something needed to be right, and she hadn't made it right yet. She was 50-something, built like someone who had learned efficiency through necessity, with the kind of face that had stopped performing anything for an audience years ago, and was now just a face, lined, attentive, honest. He sat. She pushed the flat white toward him without asking. He took it. Before you say anything, she said, tell me what you're not saying. This was, he had discovered on their one previous meeting 3 years ago, how she always began. Not with the facts, with the thing under the facts. She had explained it to him once, in a different cafe, in a different city. The facts were what people arrived with pre-organized, pre-defended. What they were not saying was what they'd come for. He wrapped both hands around the cup. I'm not saying I know what it means, he said. What I saw. Good. That's honest. I'm not saying it constitutes. He chose the word carefully, harm, in a legal sense, or in any documented sense. Also good. Keep going. I'm not saying I have grounds for anything official. He looked at the table. I'm saying that something in that 3 seconds registered with me in a way that I've been trained to pay attention to. And I don't have a protocol for what to do with it. Fiona nodded slowly. Because the protocol assumes clearer categories. Yes. Something that is definitively abuse or definitively nothing. Yes. And this is something in the space between those things. Yes. She picked up her flat white, his flat white, technically, and drank from it without apology. He didn't mind. She put down. All right, she said. Let me tell you what I see from the outside. Not from the photograph, from the pattern. She folded her hands on the table. I've worked child welfare in and around high-profile environments for 20 years. Institutional environments, political families, celebrity households, royalty twice before this. And what I have learned across all of those situations is that the most significant dynamic is very rarely the single incident. The single incident is the place where the pattern becomes visible. It's not the beginning. It's the window. Hargreave was quiet. What you described to me on the phone, she continued, was a correction delivered with speed and force inconsistent with the setting and the requirement. In a controlled, low-stakes public engagement, where the child was doing nothing beyond a minor positional drift, which was appropriate and harmless for her age. And the child did not react. At all. She looked at him directly. That combination, disproportionate response, normalized reception, is a pattern indicator. Not a conclusion. An indicator. Right, he said, because he'd known that. He'd known it in the car in the parking space outside the coffee shop he hadn't gone into. He'd known it in the kitchen with the cold tea. He had just needed someone to say it in the language of the system, so it could exist outside his own head. Now, Fiona said, here's the part you haven't asked about yet, but that's the actual question. She paused. What do you do with a pattern indicator when the child in question is Charlotte Wales, and the adult in question is the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom? The cafe was filling up around them. A man at the next table was reading a newspaper, which Hargreave could see without being able to read the headline, though he could see the color and format of the story with a photograph and a subheading that he was very sure he recognized. I don't know, he said. That's why I'm here. You know that the official channels in this situation are, she tilted her head, complicated. Yes. You know that going up through your command is not the same as going to an independent authority. Yes. You know that the people above your command have interests that are not identical to Charlotte's interests. Yes. He said it quietly, without expression. I know. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, let me tell you what your options are, she said, and I'll be very clear that none of them are clean. She held up one hand, fingers folded. Option 1. You document your concern formally through your chain of command, which is a correct procedural approach, and you accept that you have no control over what happens to that documentation or who sees it or what they do with it. She unfolded a finger. Option 2. You reach out directly to an independent child welfare body, an SBCC, the Children's Commissioner, not as a formal report, but as a consultation, using hypothetical framing to understand what the threshold for escalation would be in your situation, which keeps your options open without committing you. Another finger. Option 3. You do nothing, and you watch, and you wait to see whether what you saw on Wednesday is a singular event or whether it repeats, and you make a decision then from a more informed position. She looked at her hand. Option 4. You go to the press, which I'm not recommending. I'm naming it because it exists, and because you should be honest with yourself about whether you're considering it. He wasn't. He knew, without having to examine it, that he wasn't. That wasn't what this was. What would you do, he asked, if you were me? She looked at him with a kind of tired, clear-eyed respect that he felt was not easily given. Two, she said, and then watch. Carefully. He drank his cold flat white. Outside the cafe, the world was doing its usual Friday thing. People moving in the particular urban pattern of a city that has decided it's almost the weekend, slightly faster, slightly lighter, the collective mood lifting by increments. Taxis. Bikes. A woman with an enormous bunch of flowers. A man eating a pastry while reading something on his phone with the expression of someone who is unhappy about what they're reading, but unable to stop reading it. The photograph was everywhere. Hargreave could feel it without looking. It had the particular gravity of a thing that has reached critical mass, the kind of story that other stories start referencing, that becomes background, that gets mentioned in context it didn't originate in. He paid. Fiona Ashworth stood and buttoned her coat with a brisk efficiency of someone who has a next meeting and a next one after that, and does not need to linger in feelings. "James," she said at the door. He looked up. "You noticed," she said. "That matters. You noticed, and you didn't look away, and you didn't tell yourself it was nothing because that would have been easier. That's not small." He nodded. She left. He sat for a moment longer. Then he picked up his phone and looked for the first time since Wednesday at what the world had decided the photograph meant. It was worse than he'd expected, which was saying something, because he'd expected it to be bad. The narrative had mutated in the way that narratives do when they travel through enough different mouths with enough different agendas. It had started as Dana Osei's careful, qualified caption, which had been honest, measured, specific. It had become something harder and less careful. The phrase pattern of behavior appeared in multiple places, attached to no evidence, as if repetition was the same as proof. There were side-by-side photographs, Charlotte at other events, Camilla's hand somewhere near Charlotte, context stripped away, meaning poured in to fill the space. There was also, in a smaller current running beneath the louder one, something else. People who knew what they were looking at. People who worked in child welfare or psychology, or who had themselves been on the receiving end of the particular kind of correction that is too fast and too certain for the situation it's correcting. These people were writing with a different temperature, quieter, more specific, more careful. They were not saying Camilla was a monster. They were saying, this is what normalized looks like in a child. This is what absorbed without reaction means. These are the things worth paying attention to. Hargreave read those posts for a long time. He was not the only one. In a kitchen in Kensington, the real kitchen, the one that wasn't for events, the one with slightly chipped tile on the backsplash, and a cork board covered in drawings, Catherine was reading the same current. She was at the counter, cup of tea in one hand, phone in the other, and her face was doing the opposite of what it did in public. It was doing something unguarded and slightly unsteady, the way faces do when they're processing something they want to be simple and are finding is not. William was in the doorway. "Come away from it," he said, not unkindly, with the particular gentleness of a person who has learned that some conversations need the phone to be put down first. She didn't come away from it immediately. She read one more thing. Then, she put the phone face down on the counter. She didn't flinch, she said. He was quiet. "I watch her all the time," Catherine said. "At these things. She's so composed. She's been composed since she stopped. I thought that was her. I thought it was just who she is. She's stronger than Lewis. More controlled than George was at her age." She looked at the phone lying face down on the counter. "I didn't think about what else composure could mean." William came fully into the kitchen. He put the kettle on, which was the Wales household's default response to the kind of conversation that needed something to do with hands. "We don't know what it means," he said. "We know what happened on Wednesday. That's all we know." "Do we?" she said. "Do we know what happened on Wednesday?" He looked at her. "I wasn't watching," she said. "At that moment, I was talking to the patron from the charity, the older woman, the one who'd done the garden design. I wasn't watching Charlotte." Her voice was even, controlled, the control of someone who is managing something underneath it. James Hargreave was watching Charlotte. "Catherine, he's been watching all of them," she said. "Every engagement. That's his job. He's been watching her for 3 years, and he's very good at his job, and his face did something on Wednesday that his face does not do." William poured the water. He made 2 cups. He put one in front of her. "I need to talk to him," she said. I know it's not the protocol. I know the right thing is to go through channels and wait and let the communications team manage the narrative and be measured and not do anything that could be interpreted as." She stopped. She looked at her cup. "She's my daughter, William." The kitchen was quiet. The cork board with its drawings. The chipped tile. The particular silence of a room where something true has just been said and is now occupying all the space. "I'll make a call," he said. "Not to the protocol. Not to the channels. A different kind of call." He picked up his phone. On the other side of the city, in a flat that had nothing special about it, Hargreave's phone vibrated on the kitchen table where he'd just put it. He looked at the screen. He picked it up. "Sir," he said, "are you available to come in?" William said, "Not to the office. Here. This afternoon, if possible." A pause. Hargreave looked out his kitchen window at the patch of sky visible between buildings. Gray. The ordinary, particular gray of a London Friday. "Yes, sir," he said. He put on his jacket. He found his keys. He checked his pockets with the automatic, trained efficiency of someone whose body knows what it needs without being asked. He stood at his front door for a moment. He thought about pattern indicators and windows and the things that become visible in 3 seconds if you're positioned correctly and you're paying attention and you have not yet looked away. He opened the door. He drove across London toward a kitchen with a chip tile backsplash and a corkboard covered in drawings, where two people who were also, in every sense that mattered, someone's guard were sitting with their hand around their cups, waiting to understand what they had failed to see. Charlotte was at school. She was in an English lesson, which she liked, reading a passage about a bird. Not a robin this time, a swift, the kind that flies so continuously it sleeps in the air, the kind that never lands for years at a time, because landing is not what it was built for. She read the passage twice. She underlined the sentence about sleeping in the air. She did not know that across the city, in a kitchen she knew and a flat she'd never been to, people were finally beginning to ask the question that the crow could have told them was the right one. Not whether something had happened, whether they had been paying the right kind of attention all along.